They say a queen must bow to no one. But what of the queen whose neck bows to the blade in the cold mist of a May morning? The sky forgot how to weep. The birds held their breath. The stone courtyard stood still. A woman knelt where no crown could follow, and history turned away, ashamed. Her name was Anne, and they called her many things: sorceress, seductress, saint. But the silence she left behind had no name at all. Her enemies did not scream. They whispered. The knife that sliced her fate had no fingerprints. The king she once beguiled, the lion who burned kingdoms for her touch, had already feasted elsewhere, and so she waited, not for mercy, but for performance. For in England, even death had ceremony, and queens, when cast aside, must die beautifully. They made her dress in grey silk. They cut her hair short. They sent for a swordsman from France, a foreigner, elegant and precise because an axe was too brutish for her delicate sins. Even cruelty, when aimed at a woman who rose too high, demanded elegance. She would die like a jewel dropped from the crown, not shattered, only stolen. But no one could steal the echo she left behind. Not the king, whose hands smelled of sanctified lust, not the courtiers who smiled with rotted teeth, not the priest who blessed a lie. Anne was not slain by sword or sin. She was slaughtered by silence, by envy braided into prayer, by a love that bloomed only in power and withered in obedience. No one speaks of the moment when the wind stilled before the blade fell. No one dares recall how her eyes did not close, how her lips moved even after they had no breath. They buried her not in shame, but in haste. For the quicker the burial, the quicker the forgetting. But history never forgets a queen who refused to kneel. Not before God, not before a man, not even before the axe. Anne Boleyn was not born beneath thunder, but thunder was what followed her. The court first saw her not as a woman, but as an omen slender and sharp, like the shadow of a blade before it draws blood. Her eyes, black as secrets, were not meant to flutter nor beg, but to watch unblinking, daring, defiant. When she moved through the corridors of court, the marble sighed beneath her steps. She did not carry grace as a duty, but as a weapon. Her voice was not soft, but silken and steeped in venom. A tongue dipped in honey only to better deliver the sting. They called her ambitious, but what they meant was she refused to be silent. Where others simpered, she answered. Where others bowed, she questioned. They said she bewitched the king, but how easily men blame sorcery for the desires they cannot control. She rose not by spell, but by clarity, her mind sharp, her wit sharper, and her beauty a trap set not with vanity, but with precision. Yet all of it, the pearls, the silks, the jeweled whispers of power, was not enough to protect her from the venomous coil of the Tudor court. Behind the silks and laughter, behind the dancing and diplomatic smiles, there stretched a place where candles burned low and eyes watched from every shadow. The court was not a sanctuary. It was a theater of masks. Each smile a blade, each compliment a curse. Anne had walked into the center of this theater and claimed not only the lead role, but rewrote the script itself. She was not content to be a mistress whispered about in torchlight. She wanted the crown, and worse. She reached for it with her eyes open. She replaced a queen and bore the weight of 2 realms, England's crown and Henry's obsession. But the air thickened when obsession turned to boredom, and love soured into politics. The king had not married a woman. He had married an idea, and when that idea defied him, she became a mirror too cruel to look into. In the early days, Anne had wielded her influence like a scepter, shaping policy, whispering reform, and daring to speak where only kings were meant to speak. She bore not just the king's favor, but his fury, drawn in equal measure to her fire. And fire, in a place built of parchment and pride, was always dangerous. The courtiers watched, not with admiration, But with calculation, they measured her every glance, dissected her every word. She was not permitted to be human, only symbol. And when symbols crack, people break them. Behind her back, prayers turned to poison. The same lips that once kissed her hem now whispered that she was too clever, too daring, too much to be queen, too much to be safe. Her daughter, Elizabeth, was not the son they wanted. And in that small cradle, wrapped in the wrong destiny, Anne's own crown began to rot. The halls that once echoed with celebration now narrowed into suspicion. Her allies became ghosts, her enemies became architects, and the man who once burned the church for her would not lift a finger to save her soul. She remained outwardly unbowed. But something in her had begun to slow, not with fear, but with the weary awareness that her steps were being counted. And the rope was already braided. The court, scented of roses and rot, awaited her fall like wolves circling a dying stag. She still stood tall, still spoke with conviction, but her laughter came less frequently. And when it did, it carried an echo, the kind that follows hollow places. Henry, once her protector and pursuer, now looked at her as if she were a riddle he regretted answering. The courtiers mirrored him, their eyes scanning her like a tapestry fraying at the edges. They spoke of her miscarriages as if they were sins, of her intellect as if it were madness. The rooms she entered quieted not out of respect, but calculation. She felt it, the slow, deliberate silencing. The space she once owned was now crowded with invisible hands, pushing her gently toward the edge of something dark and final. She retreated inward, not with cowardice, but with caution. Her faith deepened not in doctrine, but in endurance. Her only salvation was her mind, that sharp, shining thing they could not touch. She read scripture not to weep, but to sharpen herself. She knew the stories of women undone by kings, knew them by name, knew them by echo, and yet she held her ground. She refused to descend into pleading or softness. If she was to fall, it would not be with bent knees. It would be with her back straight, her eyes open, and her voice unshaken. Her chambers became quieter, filled with shadows that did not answer back. She would sit long into the night, her fingers tracing the embroidery of her sleeves. The same hands that once held the heart of a king now idle, as if waiting to be bound. There is a kind of dignity that sharpens in the presence of death, not loud, not mournful, but silent and terrible. Anne wore it like armor. She stopped explaining. She stopped defending. She knew that truth had no place in a world ruled by fear. Her brother walked the halls with wary eyes. Her uncle refused to meet hers. The queen who once set fire to a dynasty was now a flame too dangerous to allow. It was not her crimes they hated, but her defiance, not her betrayal, but her refusal to be broken. Even the women in her court began to shift away, sensing the scent of blood before it bloomed. The walls whispered now. The air in her rooms turned cold, and in the corridors beyond, a scaffold was being polished. They would not tell her, not yet. But queens feel death like a pressure in the lungs. She began to wake earlier, speak less, walk slower, but she did not cower. She waited, and waiting, for a queen marked by the blade, is its own kind of war. But even within the stillness of her chamber, Anne could feel the court clawing at her name like rats beneath a floorboard. There was no day she stepped into the light without first walking through shadow. The silence of the ladies around her became more oppressive than slander. The flowers brought to her chamber began to wilt too quickly, and the silver trays came with fewer hands and colder glances. She understood that absence, too, could be a sentence. The men who once bent the knee now turned their eyes to the floor, not out of shame, but calculation. Her brother George, once defiant and brilliant, walked as if there were blades under the marble. The air was no longer hers. The walls were no longer hers. The king, her king, was no longer hers. He had turned his gaze toward Jane Seymour, but it was not her face that ruined Anne. It was the return of obedience, of quiet femininity dressed in pale modesty, where Anne had burned. Jane knelt. Where Anne had spoken, Jane bowed, and Henry, now bloated with power and bored of resistance, sought simplicity in the shell of a woman rather than the soul of one. Yet Anne still stood, still carried herself with the grace of a fallen star refusing to fade. She did not scream, she did not grovel. Her fury had folded into silence. The kind of silence that terrifies tyrants, because it does not beg, it condemns. The king could not strike her for treason of the heart, so they whispered other sins. Lies, like snakes, slithered from parchment to throne. They accused her of incest. They accused her of adultery. They accused her of laughing when the king fell from his horse. Every rumor was dressed in velvet and fed to the crown as if it were truth. And Anne, she listened, not with fear, but with the cold clarity of a woman watching the world bury itself. Still she waited, unbent, unbroken, a ghost in her own palace, not yet dead, but already disbelieved. It did not begin with a scream, but with a whisper, and the whisper was colder than steel. In the hush behind the arras, in the flicker of candlelight that never reached the corners, a plan was unfolding like a dark rose petal by poisoned petal. Intention by calculated intention. It began with silence around the council tables. Glances held too long, names spoken too quietly. The machinery of betrayal did not clatter. It purred. Anne Boleyn, still wrapped in royal silks and veiled dignity, did not yet hear the full weight of the lie pressing its fingers against her throat. But it had begun. The men who once toasted to her favor now pressed rings to lips and vowed allegiance to the shifting winds. Cromwell, the king's architect of destruction, did not need to shout. He had paper, ink, and the ear of a monarch grown tired of rebellion cloaked in elegance. Anne had not committed the crimes they would accuse her of. But truth in such a court was not a matter of evidence. It was a matter of arrangement. The very beauty that had lifted her now stood as damning testimony. Her neck, long and pale, became a prophecy. Her eyes, too intelligent, were called dangerous. Her laughter, once adored, now twisted as venomous. And so the conspiracy slithered through the palace, invisible but inexorable, feeding on fear and sanctioned by power. They needed no proof, only performance. They gathered names, lovers invented, treasons imagined, betrayals scripted. Her own brother, George, was folded into the web, not by guilt, but by proximity. He was too close, too clever, too loyal. That was enough. And those who had once danced with her now whispered of sin behind closed doors. There was no refuge left. Every glance became an accusation, every kindness a trap. She stood within the palace like a statue watching its own destruction. The queen had become a corpse in waiting, paraded still through court, but already being dissected behind the veil. When the charges were finally laid before her, they were not read with anger, but with ceremony, as though the farce deserved music. Incest, adultery, conspiracy to murder the king. They did not blush when they spoke these things. They smiled, because they had choreographed it well. The trial was not a trial, but a dirge. The lords who sat in judgment knew her fate before she stepped into the chamber. Anne, dressed in dignity rather than defense, looked them in the eyes. She did not beg. She did not wail. Her voice did not crack. She denied what was untrue, not because she believed denial would save her, but because truth deserved to stand once more before it was buried. She defended her brother with the steadiness of a woman who knew she was already written out of the world. They listened not to her words, but to their orders. The trial was only a dance, a theater where guilt was painted on the face of a queen and applauded by cowards. Even her enemies admitted the brilliance of her composure, the terrible calm of a woman who would rather die whole than live bent. She was sentenced to death before the ink dried. And outside the walls, the bells did not toll. They were reserved for coronations, not executions. In the final days before the blade, Anne was kept in the tower, not as prisoner, but as prophecy. The stones around her remembered screams. Hers would be different, not torn, not hysterical. There would be elegance in her end, because that was the final cruelty. Her enemies would grant her a clean death, not from kindness, but to make her silence eternal. She walked her cell like a ghost, rehearsing her final steps, her hands clasped in prayer, not for deliverance, but for discipline. Jane Seymour's name was already written across the tapestries, the next queen rising on the blood of the one who defied. Henry did not visit. He was hunting, laughing, preparing his wedding clothes. Anne, meanwhile, was told the swordsman would come from Calais, swift, professional, French. They had ordered a foreigner to cut her throat beautifully. In England, even death required pageantry. Her ladies wept, but Anne consoled them. She who had once been adored was now alone, and yet more queenly than ever. She refused the axe. She refused the priest's final lie. She asked only for prayers and silence. She had asked once, long ago, for justice. Now she asked only to die standing. Her enemies believed they had destroyed her, but in truth, they had only crowned her in shadow. On the morning of execution, the sun rose dull behind the fog, and the birds did not sing. She stepped into the courtyard in a grey gown, her hair tucked beneath a cap, her neck bare, white as mourning linen. The crowd, gathered not to mourn but to consume, held its breath. No one spoke. No one moved. She gave a final speech, brief, poised, loyal to a king who had buried her while breathing. Not because she believed his innocence, but because her dignity refused to flinch. Her last words praised his mercy. That, too, was power. They tied her hair back. She knelt. She waited. The swordsman hesitated, not out of fear, but reverence. He could not strike while she looked at him. So he called for a sword, a decoy, to turn her head. And when she turned, the real blade fell. Clean, fast, but not quiet. Nothing in history echoes louder than the silence that follows a queen's beheading. Her blood soaked the straw. Her lips, they said, still moved as though praying, or cursing, or simply refusing to be still. Her head was lifted, not to mock, but to declare. And then it was over. But the betrayal did not end. Her body was thrown into a coffin made for arrows. Her legacy, too, buried in haste, rewritten in ink that stank of power and fear. The courtiers returned to the feast. The king remarried. The bells rang not for her death, but for new delight. Yet something broke in the palace, something unseen. For a queen who dies unjustly leaves behind a shadow that cannot be exorcised. Anne had not simply been condemned, she had been erased. But erasure is never perfect. The walls remember. The wind along the tower green still carries her name, not as a whisper, but as a wound. They say the dead do not speak, but Anne Boleyn's silence haunted louder than any living voice. In the days that followed her execution, the stones beneath the scaffold refused to forget. Blood had dried into them, not as a stain, but as a mark, as though the land itself had signed her name in something eternal. Her death was meant to be a punctuation, a final break from disorder. Yet the realm trembled in ways no ceremony could soothe. Though her body lay beneath the chapel floor in a box too small for a queen, her presence slipped through the cracks of the court in the corners where ladies whispered, in the tremble of Jane Seymour's hands as she tried to wear a crown still warm with betrayal. Henry married again, but not even the silk of new bedsheets could muffle the absence. Anne had been many things, But above all, she had been alive startlingly, dangerously. Fully alive, and her absence was a shadow that did not retreat. The tower itself grew colder. The air thickened. And those who had signed her death warrant found their dreams unquiet. Cromwell, architect of her ruin, would find himself swallowed by the same machinery he once fed. But it was not retribution that haunted them, it was memory, uninvited and unmerciful. Anne's ghost did not scream, it watched. She had died with her eyes open, and now no one could sleep without feeling those same eyes upon them. Her daughter, the red-haired child dismissed as a mistake, grew in silence and observation. Elizabeth learned not from tutors, but from the echoes. She walked the world as her mother once had, sharp, poised, and alone. And in time, the child of the condemned would rise higher than any of them dared imagine. But this was not yet the age of redemption. In the years that followed Anne's death, no monument was raised, no truth carved into marble. She was spoken of only in half-phrases, with wary eyes and uncertain loyalty. To remember her was to risk questioning the king. To mourn her was to admit the lie. And so she was left to rot in both soil and silence. But the people remembered in ways that could not be erased. Her name, whispered through markets and alehouses, took on new shapes. Some said she was a witch and cursed the king with her dying breath. Others claimed her final prayer spared England from ruin. Truth, by then, no longer mattered, only myth. And myth has a way of surviving the blade. Anne became less a woman than a warning. The scaffold where she died became a wound in the garden of Monarchy, a place where petals refused to bloom, as though mourning the roots. Her portrait was removed from walls, her motto burned from banners, her books hidden behind other books. But even that erasure had its limits. The women who came after her learned to move quieter, to smile without meaning, to obey not because they believed, but because they had learned what happened to those who dared not to. The court had tasted the spectacle of a queen's death, and now it could not be unseen. Future queens did not wear crowns, they wore caution. Even Henry's later wives felt Anne in the space between their steps. They knew the blade was never far. It was not love that ruled England now, but fear wrapped in velvet. Anne had shattered the illusion that queens were sacred. Her blood had made it clear they were replaceable. But with her death, she had also planted a seed, something dormant, defiant, and waiting. It grew quietly in the girl child who bore her eyes. It took root in the silence that followed every decree. Anne's legacy was not in the pages written by men who despised her, but in the breath held between sentences, in the careful words of daughters taught never to speak too soon. Her final days had not been hers alone. Every step she took within the tower became a ritual. She folded her hands, not in surrender, but in strategy. She confessed, not guilt, but grace. She forgave the king, not out of love, but out of sovereignty. In dying, she had taken the one thing no man could reclaim, the manner of her ending. Even her executioner, the silent Frenchman with his polished blade, felt it. He had been summoned to kill a woman, but left as one who had touched an apparition. Anne's neck, offered freely, was not a symbol of submission, but of clarity. She had chosen how to leave the world, and the world could not bear the shape of her departure. The sky did not open, the angels did not descend, but something ancient shifted in the bones of history. The Tudor court, so gilded and proud, felt suddenly brittle. The throne seemed less like a divine seat and more like a stage soaked in falsehood. The mask of monarchy had cracked. Her enemies, those who toasted her fall, began to falter. The joy they summoned tasted sour. And in the chambers where Jane Seymour wept in childbirth, where Henry sulked and ballooned in rage, where Cromwell drafted new cruelties, Anne lingered. not as a ghost, but as a silence that bent the air. Years passed, and still, her name was not safe to speak, but it was never forgotten. Servants whispered it when candles blew out without cause. Visitors to the tower claimed they heard footsteps echoing down stone corridors long after midnight. And in the chapel, where her bones were hidden, candles flickered when no one breathed. Time turned, but Anne did not disappear. Her voice, extinguished at the scaffold, re-emerged in the daughter she had left behind. Elizabeth, once declared illegitimate, would rise not in defiance but in dominion. She would rule not to avenge Anne, but to become the thing they feared most, a queen who knelt to no man. And when Elizabeth walked the very halls where her mother had once wept, she did not flinch. She built her court with the precision of someone raised by ghosts. She wore her crown as if it had once belonged to a martyr. She ruled with the absence of apology, and in every judgment she passed, Anne's voice trembled beneath the surface. The world forgot many queens, but not this one. Not the one who died too soon, too sharp, too unafraid. Not the one whose blood watered the roots of a new reign. Anne Boleyn's legacy was not written in the lines of scripture or the scrolls of court historians, but in the deep, irrevocable truth that a woman had dared to speak, to fight, to love, and to die in the presence of power. Her body was broken, but her story refused to rot. They buried her under stones. They erased her from portraits. They called her unnatural, unholy, undone, but she was not. She was not. She was not. They say the wind still moves strangely near the place where her head fell. Not a storm, not a cry, just a subtle shifting of breath, as though history itself pauses to remember. No monument bears her defiance. No hymn sings her name. Yet the silence that followed Anne Boleyn has outlived the prayers of her enemies. She left no final curse, no cry of vengeance, no plea for absolution, only stillness, and in that stillness, a rupture. Her body rests beneath cold stone, in a box meant for arrows, but the shape of her life does not fit within walls. It moves through time with a whisper that unravels crowns and frightens kings. What is the weight of a queen's silence? What remains when the head has fallen but the gaze endures? Anne Boleyn was meant to be forgotten, a caution, a shadow, a closed chapter. But something in the earth refused. The grass grew strangely there, the air leaned in to listen, and the crown, heavy with lies, never quite settled again. Her blood had not vanished. It had soaked into something deeper than memory, into myth, into the marrow of a nation. They dressed her death in grace to conceal its horror. They gave her elegance so that the blade would appear merciful. But the sword did not silence her. It transformed her. The moment steel touched flesh, she ceased being woman, wife, traitor, queen. She became something else entirely. A reckoning, a mirror held to power, to cruelty, to fear, and to this day, the question she left behind has never been answered, not by kings, not by time. What becomes of a world that dares to kill a woman like that and believes itself safe? Not silence, not peace, only the echo and the wound.